Racist waiter humiliates Mexican young woman with mustard without knowing who her father is. Gabriela Reyes stood frozen in the middle of the crowded courtroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. The judge's gavel slammed down with finality, but she barely registered the sound over the roaring in her ears. 20 feet away, across the polished floor, stood Dr. Michael Thompson, her former colleague, mentor, and the man whose career she had just destroyed. His eyes found hers through the chaos of reporters and spectators rushing for the exits. There was no hatred there, just a hollow resignation that cut deeper than rage ever could. His shoulders slumped as a court officer approached him, and for a suspended moment, Gabriela saw not the manipulative pharmaceutical executive portrayed in her testimony, but the man who had once brought her coffee during late nights in the lab, who had championed her research when no one else would. "You did the right thing," her lawyer whispered, squeezing her arm. "Those drugs would have killed people." But the victory felt hollow. The whistleblower lawsuit had succeeded. TerraGen. Pharmaceuticals would pay millions in damages, and Michael would likely face criminal charges for falsifying safety data. Everything Gabriela had fought for over the 18 months since she'd discovered the altered test results had come to pass. So why did it feel like she was the one who had lost something irreplaceable? A flashbulb exploded nearby, and someone thrust a microphone toward her face. "Dr. Reyes, how does it feel to take down your mentor?" Before she could respond, a tall figure inserted himself between Gabriela and the press. "No comments today," Carlos Mendoza announced firmly, using his imposing frame to shield her as he guided her toward a side exit. His hand was steady against the small of her back, the same steadiness that had kept her from falling apart when the death threats started, when her car windows were smashed, when her father had called to ask if what they were saying about her on the news was true. As they pushed through the door into the February chill, Gabriela caught one last glimpse of Michael's face as he was led away. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had been to each other, everything they had lost. Then the door closed, and he was gone. Only then, safe in the dim stairwell with Carlos's solid presence beside her, did Gabriela allow her professional mask to crack. She sagged against the cold concrete wall, a sob tearing from her throat. "He was like a father to me," she whispered, "and I ruined him." Carlos didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply stood beside her, carrying the weight of her silence until she was ready to move again. 5 years earlier, Gabriela had walked into the pristine laboratory of TerraGen Pharmaceuticals with a mixture of terror and elation. At 32, with a PhD in biochemistry and a reputation for innovative thinking, she had been headhunted for their groundbreaking cancer treatment research team. It was the opportunity of a lifetime for someone whose childhood had been defined by watching her mother waste away from the very disease she now hoped to fight. On her first day, a slim man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses had approached her workstation. "Dr. Gabriela Reyes," he'd said, extending his hand. "I've read your dissertation 3 times. Your approach to targeted protein inhibitors is nothing short of revolutionary." Dr. Michael Thompson, research director and the company's scientific heart, became not just her boss, but her champion. He pushed her to refine her ideas, challenged her assumptions, and eventually promoted her to lead her own research division. Under his mentorship, Gabriela blossomed from a brilliant but unsure researcher into a confident scientific leader. "You remind me of myself 20 years ago," he told her once as they worked late into the night, too stubborn to give up on a problem, too obsessed to maintain a decent social life. He'd laughed, but there was a shadow behind his eyes that Gabriela couldn't quite interpret. By her 3rd year at TerraGen, their flagship drug, Renovar, was showing unprecedented promise in treating aggressive pancreatic cancers. The atmosphere in the lab was electric with possibility. They were going to change medicine forever. They were going to save lives. Then came the anomalies. It started with lab results that didn't quite align with earlier findings. Test animals developing unusual side effects that didn't appear in the official reports. When Gabriela raised concerns, Michael reassured her it was normal statistical noise, nothing to worry about. "We're on the verge of a breakthrough, Gabriella," he'd said, his voice intense. "Do you know how many people die waiting for treatments like this to clear regulatory hurdles? Sometimes the greater good requires a little streamlining." The moment hung between them like a suddenly visible fault line, and Gabriella felt the ground shift beneath her feet. But she wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. So she nodded and returned to her work, burying her misgivings beneath layers of trust and admiration, until the night she accidentally accessed Michael's private server while searching for some old test results. What she found shattered everything: systematically altered datasets, deleted adverse reactions, manipulated survival rates. The evidence was irrefutable. Michael had been falsifying safety data for nearly 2 years, concealing potentially lethal side effects of Renovar to keep the project moving forward. Gabriella still remembered the weight of her coffee mug slipping from nerveless fingers, shattering on the lab floor at 2:17 a.m. as the truth crashed down around her. The drug they'd been developing, the miracle cure she had devoted years of her life to perfecting, could potentially trigger catastrophic organ failure in certain patients. And Michael, brilliant, compassionate Michael, who had lifted her career and shown her what scientific excellence looked like, had known, had deliberately hidden it from everyone, including her. The betrayal was a physical pain, like someone had carved out something vital from inside her chest. For 3 days, she moved through her life in a fog, unable to eat or sleep, replaying every conversation, every late-night discussion, every moment of mentorship through this new, terrible lens. On the 4th day, she went to Michael's office, hoping against hope for an explanation that would make sense of the inexplicable. "It's more complicated than you understand," he'd said, his face ashen when she confronted him. "The company has invested billions. Thousands of jobs depend on this drug reaching market. Most patients will be fine. We'd monitor for risk factors." "Most?" Gabriella had whispered. "That's not good enough, and you know it. My mother would have been one of the vulnerable ones." Michael had reached for her then, his eyes pleading. "Give me time to fix this. We can adjust the formula, add screening protocols. If you go public now, this drug dies, along with all the people it could save." For a moment she'd wavered. Then she remembered her mother's face as the cancer consumed her, how she'd made her promise to always do what was right, no matter how difficult. "I'm sorry," she'd said, her voice breaking. "I can't be part of this." The next morning, she'd taken her evidence to the FDA. By afternoon, her key card no longer worked, and security was escorting her from the building, her personal items in a cardboard box. As they led her through the lobby, she saw Michael watching from the balcony above, his expression unreadable. That was the last time they'd spoken, until today in court, when her testimony had sealed his fate. "You need to eat something," Carlos insisted, setting a plate of pasta in front of Gabriella. It was 3 days after the verdict, and they were in her small apartment where the blinds had been drawn for weeks to avoid the photographers camped outside. Carlos Mendoza, 41, was not what Gabriella had expected in a lawyer when the whistleblower advocacy group assigned him to her case. With his perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and tendency to quote both legal precedents and obscure song lyrics with equal authority, he defied the slick attorney stereotype. His most distinctive feature was a jagged scar that ran from his right temple to his jawline, the result, she'd later learned, of standing between a client and an angry ex-husband years ago. "I'm not hungry," she said automatically, though she couldn't actually remember when she'd last eaten. "Noted. Still going to need you to eat it." He pushed the plate closer, his expression brooking no argument. It was the same quiet insistence that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. Carlos had a way of supporting her without coddling, of acknowledging the nightmare while refusing to let it consume her. She took a mechanical bite, then another. As the simple comfort of warm food hit her system, she realized she was actually starving. "They offered me a job today," she said between mouthfuls. "The University of Chicago, research position, said they admired my ethical stance." and scientific rigor. Carlos raised an eyebrow. That's good, right? Is it? Or do they just want the controversial whistleblower as a trophy hire? She set down her fork. Besides, who would want to work with me? I'm the woman who sends colleagues to prison. You're the woman who refused to let corporate profit supersede patient safety, Carlos corrected. There's a difference. Tell that to my inbox. She gestured toward her laptop, where hundreds of unread messages accumulated daily, a mix of death threats, marriage proposals, media requests, and outright hatred. The case had struck a nerve, dividing the scientific community between those who saw her as a hero and those who considered her a traitor to her team. Carlos studied her, his gaze too perceptive. It's not just the public reaction that's bothering you. Gabriela looked away. I keep having the same dream. I'm back in the lab with Michael, and we're celebrating because Renovar worked. It actually worked without the side effects. Everyone's lives are better. My mother is somehow there, alive. Her voice cracked. Then I wake up and remember reality. You couldn't have saved your mother, Gabriela. Not with that drug, not the way it was. I know that, logically. She wrapped her arms around herself. But I destroyed something good along with the bad. The core research was sound, with proper testing, with honesty about the limitations. It could have helped people eventually. And it still might. The company's new management is continuing the research with proper protocols. Without Michael's brilliance? Without mine? She shook her head. Some things once broken can't be put back together the same way. Carlos was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her perpetually cold ones. Maybe they're not supposed to be put back together the same way, he said quietly. Maybe they become something different, something you can't imagine right now. His touch anchored her, and for the first time since she'd discovered the altered data, Gabriela felt a tiny flicker of possibility beyond the wreckage of her old. The sound of her phone ringing shattered the moment. Gabriela froze when she saw the caller ID, Terragen Pharmaceuticals. She stared at it, heart racing, until Carlos gently took the phone from her trembling hand. Dr. Reyes's phone, he answered, his lawyer persona sliding into place. As he listened, his expression shifted from wariness to surprise. I see. I'll discuss it with her and get back to you. When he hung up, his eyes were serious. That was Elena Rodriguez, the new CEO at Terragen. She wants to meet with you, says it's important, something about Michael's personal research files that were encrypted. Apparently, you're the only one who might be able to access them. Gabriela felt a chill run through her. Why would I help them, after everything? Because according to Rodriguez, those files might contain Michael's work on the side effect problems. He was trying to fix it, Gabriela, right up until the end. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the implications hit her. If Michael had found a solution, if he'd been working to correct his mistake rather than just cover it up, it changed nothing legally, but emotionally. I need to see those files, she whispered. The Terragen campus looked exactly as it had 18 months ago, yet felt entirely foreign as Gabriela walked through the security checkpoint. Gone was the easy familiarity of belonging. In its place, the acute discomfort of being both intruder and attraction. Employees stared as she passed, conversations halting mid-sentence. Elena Rodriguez, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, met them in the lobby rather than making them come up to the executive floor, a subtle courtesy that Gabriela appreciated. Dr. Reyes, Mr. Mendoza, thank you for coming. Her handshake was firm, her eyes evaluating. This way, please. She led them not to a conference room as Gabriela had expected, but down to the research floors, to Michael's old private lab. The familiar route made Gabriela's chest tighten. How many times had she walked these halls, filled with purpose and certainty? How many breakthrough moments had she shared with the team that now wouldn't meet her eyes? The lab had been preserved almost exactly as Michael had left it, which struck Gabriela as odd until Rodriguez explained. The FBI went through everything, of course, but we kept it intact otherwise. Institutional knowledge is hard to replace, even when it comes with complications. A computer workstation sat in the corner, separated from the main lab equipment. Rodriguez gestured to it. This is what we need help with. His personal research database is encrypted, and our IT people haven't been able to crack it. But he apparently told several colleagues that if anything happened to him, you would know how to access it. Gabriela felt Carlos's questioning gaze, but kept her expression neutral. Did he say why I would know? No, just that you would. Gabriela approached the computer slowly, memories washing over her. She sat in Michael's chair, feeling like an imposter, and stared at the login screen. What password would Michael have? Expected her to guess. Something from their shared history, obviously, but what? She tried several combinations with no success. His wife's birthday, the date TerraGen was founded, the molecular formula for their first successful compound. Nothing. Worked. Then she remembered a conversation from years ago. They'd been discussing encryption over late-night takeout, and Michael had mentioned a philosophy about passwords. The best ones aren't random, he'd said. They're meaningful questions, with answers only the right person would know. Gabriela stared. At the screen, a question suddenly forming in her mind. What if the password wasn't a word or a date, but an answer to a question that had defined their professional relationship? She typed, "What would you sacrifice to save lives?" The system rejected it immediately. Too long, too obvious. Gabriela closed her eyes, trying to think like Michael. What question had truly mattered to him? What had been at the heart of his ethical compromise? Then it hit her. The first serious conversation they'd ever had about why she'd gone into cancer research. She'd told him about her mother, about watching her die and feeling helpless. Michael had asked her one simple question that, what would have saved her? Her fingers moved over the keyboard. Time. The screen blinked, then transformed as the encryption dissolved, revealing folders upon folders of research data. "You did it," Rodriguez breathed, leaning forward. But Gabriela barely heard her. She was already scanning through the files, her trained eye quickly sorting relevant information from background noise. What she found left her breathless. Michael hadn't just been covering up problems, he'd been working obsessively to solve them. Nights, weekends, holidays, all filled with research iterations, alternative formulations, genetic markers to identify at-risk patients. He'd been racing against the corporate timeline, trying to fix the flaws before the drug went to market. And according to his most recent notes, he'd been close to a breakthrough. Very close. He was trying to save both, Gabriela whispered. The drug and the patients. He thought he just needed more time. Which your whistleblowing took away, Rodriguez observed, not unkindly. Which his own deception made necessary, Carlos countered. They were both right, Gabriela realized. The situation had never been black and white, villain and hero. It was a collision of desperation, ambition, compassion, and fear. Michael's fear that the bureaucracy of drug approval would kill patients waiting for treatment. Her fear that rushed approval would kill them instead. What will you do with this research now? She asked Rodriguez. The CEO studied her thoughtfully. That depends. Our scientific team could eventually make sense of it, but it would take months, maybe years, to understand his thinking process. The road's not taken. She paused. Unless we had someone who understood both the science and Michael's methods, someone who could pick up where he left off. The implication hung in the air between them. You want me to come back, Gabriela said flatly, after everything. I want you to finish what you both started, Rodriguez corrected. Properly this time, with full transparency, rigorous testing, and your name on the patent alongside his. She gestured around the lab. This could be yours, a team of your choosing, and a chance to create the drug that might have saved your mother, the right way. Gabriela felt dizzy with conflicting emotions. The offer was everything she'd ever wanted professionally, but wrapped in layers of ethical complexity. Could she work with people who had once viewed her as a traitor? Could she separate Michael's legitimate research from his ethical failures? Could she face herself in the mirror if she walked away from the chance to complete their work properly? I need time to think, she managed. Of course, Rodriguez nodded. The offer remains open. In the meantime, we'll continue analyzing these files. As they left the building, Carlos was uncharacteristically quiet. It wasn't until they reached the car that he spoke. "You're considering it," he said, not a question. "I'd be a fool not to." Gabriela leaned against the car door, suddenly exhausted. "That research could help thousands of people." "It could," he agreed. "But at what cost to you? These are the same people who let you twist in the wind when you exposed the truth. The same company that prioritized profits over safety until they were forced to change. They have new leadership now. People change. Institutions rarely do." His voice softened. "I just don't want to see you sacrifice yourself on the altar of scientific progress. Not when you've already given so much." His concern touched her, but also sparked an unexpected flare of irritation. "Isn't that my decision to make, my risk to take?" "Absolutely," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "Just making sure you're going into it with open eyes." They drove in silence for several miles, the tension between them shifting into something more complex. Finally, Gabriela spoke. "I visited Michael in detention yesterday," she admitted. "Before I met with you." Carlos's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "And you didn't think to mention this because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it, because I needed to do it alone." She turned to look out the window, watching the city blur past. "I needed to see him, to understand." "And did you understand?" Gabriela closed her eyes, remembering Michael's face across the visiting room table. He'd looked older, diminished without his lab coat and authority, yet somehow more authentic. He said he was sorry. Not for the falsified data. He still believes his approach would have saved more lives in the long run, but for betraying my trust, for putting me in an impossible position. She swallowed hard. "He said watching me walk away with that box of my belongings was the moment he knew he'd lost his way completely." Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "Do you forgive him?" It was the question she'd been asking herself since leaving the detention center. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I understand him better now. The desperation, the conviction that the end justified the means. He lost his daughter to pancreatic cancer when he was in medical school. Did you know that? It wasn't in our research files. He never talked about it, but it drove everything he did." She turned back to Carlos. "We're not so different, he and I. Both haunted by the people we couldn't save. Both willing to sacrifice almost anything to prevent others from experiencing that loss. The difference being that you drew a line he was willing to cross," Carlos pointed out. "Yes," she acknowledged. "But who's to say where I would have drawn that line if I'd been in his position for 20 years instead of 5? If I'd watched promising treatments die in regulatory limbo while patients suffered? We like to think our ethics are absolute, but they're tested in the crucible of real life," Carlos finished. "I get it. I've defended enough complicated people to know that good and evil rarely exist in their pure forms." The car slowed as they approached Gabriela's apartment building. The media presence had finally diminished, with only one persistent photographer remaining across the street. Progress of a sort. "Whatever you decide about Terragen," Carlos said as he parked, "just remember you have options. The university position, consulting, starting fresh somewhere else entirely." Gabriela nodded, but they both knew the pull of unfinished work, of potential breakthroughs left dangling, would likely prove irresistible. Science had been her refuge since childhood, the one place where problems, however complex, eventually yielded to persistent inquiry. The one place where she felt closest to her mother's memory. 3 weeks later, Gabriela stood in front of Michael's old laboratory, now bearing her name on the door. She had negotiated hard with Rodriguez, complete research autonomy, a hand-picked team, unprecedented transparency measures, and a seat on the ethics committee. Most importantly, a binding agreement that no drug would proceed to human trials without addressing all safety concerns, regardless of financial pressures. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing involving human systems ever could be, but it was a chance to reclaim what had been lost and transform it into something better. As she swiped her new access card, Gabriella thought about Michael, awaiting sentencing in a minimum security facility, about Carlos, who had grudgingly supported her decision while making her promise to call him at the first sign of ethical compromise, about her mother, whose photograph now sat on her new desk alongside her degrees and awards. The laboratory door slid open, revealing the familiar equipment, the pristine workstations, the weight of both possibility and responsibility. Gabriella took a deep breath and stepped forward into the silence. Not the hollow silence of loss that had dominated the past 18 months, but the pregnant silence of potential, of work yet to be done, of wrongs that might yet be made right. Wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. Character count 14,992,